I have been an archive witness for the Veth Communion for 112 years. In that time, I have logged 4,847 first contact events. I have recorded the scan profiles of 1,200 distinct vessel classes, cataloged the electromagnetic signatures of 340 civilizations we chose to leave in peace, and filed the terminal records of 67 species we determined, after thorough assessment, could not be permitted to advance further. I have never once been wrong about a scan result, not because I am exceptional. Because the Veth Communion's methodology is exceptional, and I am merely its instrument. A scan is not an act of aggression. I want that understood before I set down the rest of this record. The Communion does not move without data. We do not fire without comprehension. We do not destroy what we have not first read, measured, cataloged, and judged. This is our law. It is the reason we have survived when 14,000 other civilizations in the 11 millennia of our recorded history have not. We scan. We understand. We decide. In that order, always in that order, and nothing we have ever scanned has challenged the sequence. I am filing this record under my own designation, Serath 7, Archive Witness, assigned to the Keth Corridor Survey Formation, because I am currently the only surviving member of that formation. All 2,700 scan vessels dispatched under Survey Commander Veilom are gone. I watched them go. I watched them go in 9 minutes and 14 seconds, and I have now spent the last 31 hours attempting to construct a record that is accurate, because accuracy is the only thing I have left to offer. The vessel was designated Hull Incident 7 in our running survey log. I will refer to it, from this point forward, by the designation stenciled on its port flank in a human script our translation matrix recovered without difficulty. It was called the Ardent Meridian. I do not know what that means. The translation matrix renders it as something adjacent to the burning through line, or the resolute course, or simply the line that does not deviate. I have run the translation 6 times since filing this record began. 6 different shades of the same idea, a path that holds, a direction that does not alter, a thing that goes where it is going regardless of what stands between it and there. I know now why they named it that. I did not know at the time. The Keth Corridor sits in what our survey archive designates as Sector 12 of the Outer Buffer, a region of space that, until this incident, had seen no traffic from any advanced civilization in at least 400 years. It is not a dramatic place. It has no particular strategic significance, no rare resource deposit, no navigational convenience that a civilization with mature, faster-than-light capability would find especially valuable. There is a dead binary remnant at its midpoint, one cold dwarf, one long-dissipated gas band, a field of long-period asteroids slowly spiraling inward over geological time. Dust lanes, the usual gravitational geometry of a corridor that has been geologically quiet for so long that it has become unremarkable in the most complete sense of the word. I have worked 3 previous survey rotations in sectors adjacent to 12. I am familiar with this kind of space. It has a stillness to it that I have always found. This is an admission that does not sit easily in a formal record, but I will make it, because honesty serves us better now than professional decorum. I have always found it peaceful, the kind of emptiness that feels restful rather than threatening. A corridor with nothing in it is a corridor requiring nothing of you. You scan it, you confirm its emptiness, you log its emptiness, and you move on. We entered the Keth Corridor on standard survey approach. Formation spread across 11 light minutes, 2,700 scan tenders arrayed in the Communion's established deep probe lattice, with myself and my vessel, the Witnessing I Perpetual, positioned at the formation's trailing edge per standard archive witness protocol. I am always at the edge. I am the one who watches and records. I am never at the center of anything. This is, I now understand, the reason I am alive. Survey Commander Veilom's first communique to the formation was routine. The Keth corridor had shown elevated residual energy signatures on our long-range preliminary, past 3 standard cycles earlier. Nothing alarming, a thermal gradient consistent with a recently active vessel drive, a faint electromagnetic scatter that could have been a navigation transponder's last dying pulse, a modest gravimetric variance that suggested mass in the corridor's mid-band that was not charted in our stellar survey. We had seen combinations like this before. A derelict, in most cases, an abandoned outpost in a few. Once, memorably, a comet with an unusual mineral composition that was generating its own signature through interaction with the local magnetosphere. We were not alarmed. The nearest inhabited system was a mid-tier industrial world called Pravitz's Crossing, under Communion administrative observation but not yet formally catalogued, whose most advanced space-going vessels were sublight or haulers. The Keth corridor itself was a dead drift. There was no strategic reason for anything significant to be there. I remember thinking, as we approached the mid-band coordinates and the long-range scan began to resolve its preliminary shape, that this would be another derelict notation. A hull from one of the regional powers, the Geithran Compact, perhaps, or the Drevosi Union, both of whom had been active in this sector 2 centuries ago before their respective consolidations. I began composing the preliminary notation in my mind. Hull of probable Geithran manufacture. Estimated age 1 to 2 centuries. Structural integrity nominal to degraded. Drive status offline. No active emissions. Recommend flag for. Then the preliminary scan resolved its shape, and I stopped composing. The vessel sitting in the Keth corridor mid-band was not a Geithran derelict. It was not a Drevosi hulk. It was not anything in our archive. The Ardent Meridian sat at absolute rest relative to the corridor's drift median, which was itself unusual. A drifting derelict does not hold position. It goes where momentum and gravity take it, and a vessel that holds position in open space is a vessel with active attitude correction systems, which means active power, which means it is not dead. It was running on minimal signature. Someone had, with considerable deliberate care, reduced every detectable emission to as close to zero as the laws of physics permitted. The thermal variance that had flagged our preliminary pass was, I would later determine, a microscopic inefficiency in the hull's thermal management, a leak no larger than the radiation output of a single low-wattage lamp, bleeding through what I now know was a battle-damaged panel on the vessel's ventral surface. Without that single flaw, we would have passed the Keth corridor without stopping. Everything else the Ardent Meridian was doing, it was doing silently. Its length was 6,100 meters. I want to pause on that figure, because I do not think figures of that kind land with appropriate weight when they are simply stated. 6,100 meters. Our survey formation scan tender vessels, each one a capable and well-armed deep probe platform, ran between 400 and 600 meters in length. Our largest standard deployment vessels, the heavy survey carriers we had not brought on this run, because the Keth corridor had shown nothing on preliminary pass to warrant them, ran to perhaps 2,200 meters. The largest Geithran vessel in our archive topped out at 3,100 meters, and that was their apex capital ship, their single most powerful military hull, of which they had built exactly 4 in their entire recorded history. The Ardent Meridian was 6,100 meters long. But it was not merely its size that stopped my notation mid-composition. Size alone is a datum, impressive, catalogable, filed and cross-referenced against the archive's scale distribution models. What stopped me was the hull itself. A vessel's hull, to a trained scan reader, tells a story. The Geithran built in stressed alloy composites that gave their hulls a characteristic layered density profile. The Drevosi favored ceramic matrix construction that showed up on scan as a specific internal reflection pattern. Every spacefaring civilization whose hulls we had read had construction signatures as distinctive as a voice, because every civilization builds with the materials and the engineering philosophy available to it, and no two civilizations have identical materials or identical philosophy. You learn to recognize them. After 30 or 40 contact events, you begin to develop intuitions about construction origin the way a reader of text develops intuitions about an author's voice before they have consciously analyzed the grammar. The Ardent Meridian's hull did not match any construction signature in the archive. Not approximately, not within an acceptable variance. It did not match anything. The preliminary scan structural read returned a density profile I had never seen, not merely denser than what we catalogued as the upper range of practical hull construction, which would have been remarkable enough, but denser in a way that suggested the material itself was different. Not alloy, not ceramic, not any of the composite families our archive recognized. Something else, manufactured or discovered or grown, I could not determine which, that we had no reference for. The hull was also not uniform. This was the second thing the preliminary scan told me, and the second thing that stopped me mid-notation. A constructed hull has engineering patterns. Internal frames, structural members, the geometry of load-bearing elements, these create a characteristic internal topology, different for different civilizations, but always recognizably a topology, always built on a repeating organizational principle. The Ardent Meridian's internal structure had an organizational principle, but it was not one I recognized, and the more I tried to fit it to any model in my experience, the less it resembled any model. It was not chaotic. It was structured. Deliberately, precisely structured. But the structure was, and I am reaching for a word I do not entirely have confidence in, biological, not in the sense of organic matter, in the sense of a nervous system, a distributed architecture without a clear center, with redundant pathways ramifying through the whole material in a pattern that looked, to my scan-trained instincts, less like an engineered system and more like something that had been grown into the material over a very long time. I filed none of this in my preliminary notation. I marked the vessel as requiring deep scan assessment and closed the notation with the standard pending flag. Survey Commander Veilom's communiqué, when the preliminary scan returned its first reliable geometry data, was characteristically measured. The commander had been at this longer than I had 172 years as a survey commander, which was extraordinary longevity even for a Veth of his caste. He had seen things that had surprised him before. He did not panic. His communiqué noted the vessel's unusual size, flagged it for attention, and ordered the formation to hold at current range while the deep scan preparation was completed. I remember thinking, yes, this is the correct response. Observe, prepare, scan thoroughly, understand before deciding, the old certainties, the reliable sequence. The deep scan preparation took 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, the Ardent Meridian did not move, did not alter its emissions profile, did not hail us, did not in any way indicate that it was aware of our presence, which a ship of that size, with presumably sophisticated sensor equipment, almost certainly was. Survey Commander Veilom noted this in his formation log. A vessel aware of our approach that chooses not to respond to our presence. This indicated one of three possibilities. A vessel whose crew was incapacitated. A vessel whose crew was deliberately concealing its awareness for tactical purposes. Or a vessel entirely automated, running on programmed parameters without active crew decision-making. The commander judged the third possibility most likely, based on the complete absence of any internal energy signature consistent with biological life support activity. The Ardent Meridian read, on that preliminary scan, as a very large, very old, extremely well-maintained automated vessel of unknown origin, holding position in the Keth corridor for reasons our scan had not yet resolved. An automated vessel. That assessment was not wrong, exactly. It was simply incomplete in a way that would cost us everything. Those 40 minutes of preparation were, I have thought since, the last time I operated inside a framework that made complete sense to me. The communion's methodology, its patient, thorough, competent methodology, was fully functional. We were doing exactly what we should do. The formation was arrayed correctly. The deep scan systems were being calibrated with appropriate care. The commander was being appropriately deliberate. Everything was as it should be, and there was no moment in those 40 minutes in which I felt anything I would characterize as dread. I mention this because I want the record to be clear. We were not careless. We were not overconfident in any way that violated our doctrine. We did everything right. I want the convocation to understand that the outcome was not the result of error on our part, because I have spent 31 hours in transit composing this record, and a substantial portion of that time attempting to identify the error, and I cannot find one, and I think it is important that the record reflect that. The error was categorical, not procedural. The error was in believing that our category, scan and understand, was a category that applied to everything. That belief has served us for 11 millennia. It did not serve us in the Keth corridor. The deep scan formation locked in at 11 light minutes, close enough for a high-resolution structural read, far enough to give us reaction time if the vessel proved to be armed and triggered. This was standard doctrine. We had done this 4,847 times, as I noted. The deep scan pulse was precisely calibrated. A broad-spectrum electromagnetic probe layered with gravimetric subsurface readers and a neutrino flux analysis beam that could penetrate hull plating up to 40 meters thick and return detailed internal structural imaging. Nothing hidden from a Veth deep scan. Nothing. We had scanned warships before. Active ones, inactive ones, hulks, derelicts, vessels with their weapons powered and their crews at battle stations. None of them had ever presented a problem. You scan a vessel, you understand what it is, you decide what to do with the information. The scan is not a provocation. The scan is not a threat. The scan is simply the communion's way of seeing, and nothing that has been seen has ever objected to being seen. The formation went to deep scan. I want to be precise about the timeline, because precision is the only dignity this record can offer the 2,700 who are gone. At timestamp 0:00:00, the formation's deep scan pulse initiated. The pulse traveled outward from the formation lattice at standard propagation speed, reached the Ardent Meridian's hull at timestamp 0:00:31, and began its penetration sequence. At timestamp 0:00:31, 4/4 of a second after the pulse made contact with the hull, the Ardent Meridian's configuration changed. Not dramatically, not with weapons ports opening or drive emissions spiking or any of the things our formation was watching for. The change was subtler than that, and in my recorded sensory feed from that moment, which I have reviewed 47 times since filing this record began, I can see exactly what it was. A ripple, a shift in the electromagnetic field profile around the hull, lasting perhaps 1/3 of a second. The kind of shift that, had I been watching for it, I might have identified as the rebalancing of an active power system that has just been triggered by an external input. I was not watching for it. None of us were. We were watching for weapons ports. We were watching for drive emissions. We were watching for the things that mean danger in the ways we understand danger. We were not watching for a hull that responds to a scan the way a reflex arc responds to a tap on the knee. The formation's first casualty was a scan tender designated Survey Platform 11. I know this because Survey Platform 11 was at the formation's leading point, closest to the Ardent Meridian, deepest into the probe lattice, first in the sequence of the response. At timestamp 0:00:32, Survey Platform 11's telemetry ceased. Not gradually, not with a damage progression that told a story of systems failing in sequence. Ceased. There was signal and then there was not signal, and the interval between them was smaller than our telemetry resolution could measure. I did not understand what had happened to Survey Platform 11. I understood what happened to Survey Platforms 12 and 13, because by the time they were gone by timestamp 0:00:33, 1 second after the scan pulse reached the hull, I had reoriented my own vessel's sensor array toward the Ardent Meridian, and I was watching. The hull was not firing in the way I understand firing. There were no visible weapons discharges that my sensor array could resolve as directed energy beams or kinetic projections. What my array was showing me instead was a field effect, a cascading electromagnetic and gravimetric disturbance propagating outward from the hull in a precise, geometrically structured pattern. The pattern corresponded exactly to the positions of the scan formation's probe nodes, not to our vessel positions in general. To our probe node specifically, the specific emission points from which our deep scan pulse had originated. The Ardent Meridian was not targeting our ships. It was targeting our scan. It was responding to the sources of the probe the way a nerve responds to the source of pain, not with deliberate malice, not with calculation, but with the implacable, pre-programmed accuracy of a system that has been built, at some foundational level, to answer this specific stimulus with this specific response. I have since done my best to understand what I observed, and the framework I have arrived at is this. The Ardent Meridian's combat systems are not a layer on top of the vessel. They are not software loaded onto a platform. They are the platform, built into the hull substrate at a level that our scan attempted to read, and that the hull's own architecture interpreted on contact with our probe as an act of acquisition, as the first stage of being targeted. And the hull's response to being targeted was not to await crew decision, not to query a command authority, not to calculate odds or assess threat level. It responded. Immediately, automatically, without deliberation. The way a hand pulls from a flame before the mind has processed the heat. Between timestamp 0:00:31:4 and timestamp 0:09:45 the formation ceased to exist. I cannot give a vessel-by-vessel account of the losses, because I did not have the capacity to observe each one individually. I was observing the Ardent Meridian. I was observing the field effect propagating through the probe lattice. I was watching the telemetry signals vanish, one by one and then in clusters, as the response pattern worked its way through the formation's geometry with the methodical, unhurried efficiency of something that does not tire and does not hesitate. What I can say is this: the response was proportional. I use that word with full awareness of how inadequate it is, but I cannot find a better one. The Ardent Meridian did not deploy more force than was necessary to neutralize each probe node. It did not continue attacking a position after the probe source there had been eliminated. When a telemetry signal ceased, the response shifted to the next active probe node in the lattice sequence. When there were no more active probe nodes, the response stopped. It was not warfare. It was not even defense, in the way I understand defense. It was a correction. The hull had been probed, the probe sources had been cataloged by the reflex architecture, and the reflex architecture had corrected for each one in sequence. A thing of trained, built-in molecular-level response, doing exactly what it was built to do. Survey Commander Veilom's vessel, the formation's command tender, positioned at the formation center, was among the last to go. I know this because his command channel remained active until timestamp 0:09:22, which was 23 seconds before the final telemetry signal in the formation ceased. I have his last communique in my record. I will not reproduce it in full. It was not a composed document. It was a man's voice in a vessel that was shaking, watching the formation's telemetry board go dark box by box, talking because talking was what he had always done in the face of the incomprehensible, because he had had 172 years of practice at making sense of things that initially seemed not to make sense, and habit is a powerful thing even when sense has completely abandoned the situation. What he said in the last 4 seconds of his communique was this: "It didn't target us. It targeted the scan. It doesn't know we're here. It doesn't." The channel dropped. At timestamp 0:09:45, the last telemetry signal in the formation ceased. At timestamp 0:09:46, my sensor array registered one final field effect from the Ardent Meridian, a broad, low-intensity sweep that I initially feared was a search pattern, looking for survivors looking for me. I powered down every active system on my vessel instantly, every non-essential function, dropping to the absolute floor of my own emissions profile, going as dark as the physics of a living vessel will permit. I held that configuration for a period I will not embarrass myself by quantifying, because the number would demonstrate the depth of my fear, and this is a formal record. A very long period. The sweep did not repeat. When I brought my sensors back up, with extreme caution, at the lowest resolution settings, I found the Keth corridor had changed. There was debris. The corridor's mid-band, which had been, when we arrived, a clean drift zone with only the Ardent Meridian's minimal signature to disturb it, was now populated with a dispersal pattern covering 11 light-minutes of space. The dispersal pattern was consistent with the simultaneous structural failure of 2,700 vessels in a specific geometric configuration. Consistent, not random. The debris was where the formation had been, spread in the exact lattice shape of the probe formation, frozen by the physics of how things fall apart and drift when they come apart in space. 2,700 vessels. The Veth Communion's standard deep probe lattice formation, deployed in full for the first time in 61 years, because the Keth corridor's preliminary signatures had warranted a thorough survey, and Survey Commander Veilom had believed in thoroughness. Gone in 9 minutes and 14 seconds. The Ardent Meridian had not moved. I want to be clear about this. In the 9 minutes and 14 seconds during which the formation ceased to exist, the Ardent Meridian altered its heading by 0 degrees. Its drive emissions, still minimal, still running at the floor of detectability, did not spike. Its hull configuration did not alter. It did not accelerate. It did not slow. It did not make any outward movement that could be characterized as the movement of a vessel that has just been in a confrontation and is responding to the outcome of that confrontation. It was simply there, the way it had been there before, at the same position, at the same minimal emission signature, doing whatever it had been doing before the formation arrived. I do not know what it had been doing. I do not know where it was going, or where it had come from, or what its purpose was in the Keth corridor. I did not dare scan it again to find out. I spent the next 7 hours in the Keth corridor watching it. This was not a decision made from courage. It was a decision made from the paralysis of function that descends on an archive witness when the archive has reached its limits. Because what an archive witness is built to do is observe and record. And the most significant thing the Veth Communion has ever encountered was sitting 11 light minutes away from me, and I could not make myself leave without understanding at least some portion of what I was looking at. I watched without scanning, my passive sensor array stripped to the most basic electromagnetic reception, the kind of seeing that requires no signal sent, only signal received, kept its focus on the Ardent Meridian's hull throughout those 7 hours. In those 7 hours, the hull did 3 things. The first, at timestamp 1:03:17, a set of panels on the vessel's ventral surface, including, I believe, the panel from which the thermal leak had been emanating, shifted configuration. Not dramatically. A millimeter of movement, perhaps less, across a surface area of several hundred square meters. A maintenance adjustment. The hull patching itself or being patched from within, the damaged panel resealed, the thermal leak closed. The Ardent Meridian's emission signature, which had already been barely measurable, dropped another fractional increment closer to silence. It was more thorough than before, more careful, as if it had been reminded by some event, perhaps the event of the previous 9 minutes, that silence mattered. The second thing, at timestamp 3:41:08, the debris field began to shift. Not dramatically, not through any active process I could observe, simply the natural drift of the corridor's gravitational gradient, moving the 2,700 vessels worth of dispersed material on its slow way toward the corridor's dust lanes. The Ardent Meridian's passive sensor field, which I had by now concluded was always active, always reading, and required no scan pulse to do its reading, must have been watching the debris too, because at timestamp 3:41:09, 1 second after the drift began, the Ardent Meridian's attitude correction systems made an infinitesimal adjustment. The vessel moved perhaps 40 meters laterally, just enough to ensure the drifting debris would not intersect its course. It moved out of the way. It moved out of the way of the debris from the 2,700 ships it had, killed. I find myself struggling with the word. The vessel had not killed them the way I understand killing. It had responded, and they had been in the path of the response. They had been the source of the stimulus, and the stimulus had been answered, and they were gone. And now their remnants were drifting into the Ardent Meridian's path, and the vessel moved 40 meters to avoid them, the way you step around something on the floor. The third thing is the thing I find most difficult to record. At timestamp 6:59:04, 3 minutes before I finally gathered myself to leave the Keth corridor, the Ardent Meridian's drive signature changed. Not dramatically, not to the kind of acceleration signature that would indicate combat speed or emergency maneuver. A gentle, steady, deliberate increase. The vessel was resuming travel. I watched it begin to move. It was heading, as best my passive array could determine from the initial vector, deeper into the corridor, away from the communion's inner systems, toward the outer buffer and whatever lay beyond it. It did not alter course to investigate the debris field. It did not send a signal on any frequency. It simply began to move, at a steady, unhurried acceleration, on the heading it had apparently been holding when it paused to rest in the Keth corridor, resuming that heading with the same patient, complete indifference to everything around it that it had demonstrated throughout. I watched it move for 11 minutes. I watched its emission signature grow smaller and more attenuated as the distance increased, until it was once again at the edge of detectability. Then I watched it pass beyond my passive array's reliable resolution and become nothing but a fading trace on my sensors, and then nothing at all. It did not look back. I am aware that is a meaningless thing to say about a vessel. It implies intention, awareness, choice. But it is what I have, and it is what I am filing. The Ardent Meridian did not look back. I left the Keth corridor at timestamp 8:00:00. I filed my emergency transit request with the nearest communion relay station at timestamp 8:03:41. I am currently in transit to the communion's third archive at Vel Asham, where I will deliver this record in full, and where, I am told, a senior convocation is being assembled to consider its implications. I have had the entirety of this transit to compose this record, and to think, and I will set down the conclusions I have reached, for whatever they are worth, because conclusions are what the archive is for, and I am still an archive witness, and this is still what I do. The first conclusion: the Ardent Meridian is not, in any sense our archive has prepared us for, a weapon. I want to be clear about this distinction. A weapon is a thing deployed by a decision. A weapon waits for the decision that releases it. A weapon is the expression of a will. The Ardent Meridian is something else. It is more like an immune system. It reads its environment continuously and passively, and when the environment presents something that its architecture has been built to recognize as acquisition, as targeting, as the first stage of attack, it responds. The response is not decided. It is not calculated. It is enacted at the level of the hull's own substrate, below any threshold at which crew decision or command authority would intervene. It is built that way, built to respond before it can be stopped. I do not know how long it took them to build that in. I suspect a very long time. I suspect a civilization that had been attacked enough times in enough ways to understand that the moment of probe, the moment of scan, the moment of reading the hull before moving against it, was the most dangerous moment, the moment in which the advantage passed to the attacker, and that a hull which could respond in that moment, automatically, without deliberation, would survive engagements that a hull relying on crew decision-making would not. They built survival into the material, not into the software, not into the doctrine, into the material, into whatever the hull is made of, that unrecognized density profile, that distributed nervous system architecture that our preliminary scan could not match to anything in 11,000 years of gathered knowledge. The combat reflex of the Ardent Meridian is not a protocol that can be countermanded by a commander deciding not to fire. It is as far below the level of decision as the flinch of a hand from heat is below the level of thought. It is not that the vessel chose not to wait for orders. It is that waiting for orders in that fraction of a second is not what that part of the vessel does. That part of the vessel simply answers. I have tried in the hours of this transit to imagine the engineering that produces this result. The closest analogy I can construct from my own biology is the proprioceptive system, the part of the nervous architecture that maintains balance and spatial orientation below the threshold of conscious thought, faster than thought, continuously and without effort. The body knows where it is in space before the mind does. The body corrects for a stumble before the mind has finished perceiving the stumble. This is not intelligence. It is not even decision. It is architecture that has been refined over a very long time to be very good at a very specific thing. And what the Ardent Meridian's architecture has been refined to be very good at, over whatever span of time the humans took to build it this way, is this: answering anything that touches the hull as if it were an attack. Every civilization we have ever scanned has had weapons layered on top of a hull. The weapons could be disabled, or removed, or outranged, or anticipated and countered. The hull was always just the hull. The Ardent Meridian's hull is the weapon. The second conclusion: the Communion's doctrine of scan first is, in the context of this vessel, not a survival advantage. It is a triggering mechanism. Every protection our methodology has afforded us for 11 millennia depended on a simple fact: what we scan does not respond to being scanned. We read. We are not read back. We see. We are not seen responding to being seen. The Ardent Meridian ended that fact completely for the first time in our recorded history. And I should be clear that it ended it casually, without alarm, without what I would recognize as escalation or preparation. The formation fired the scan pulse, and the hull answered, and the formation was gone, and the hull went back to being quiet. There was no moment in that sequence that I can identify as the Ardent Meridian's equivalent of my own alarm, my own sudden recognition that something unprecedented was occurring. It did not experience the encounter as unprecedented. It experienced the encounter as routine stimulus, routine response, resume course. How many times, I find myself wondering, has this happened before? How many formations from how many civilizations have approached the Ardent Meridian on its patient journey through whatever corridors it travels, decided that the massive silent hull deserved a closer look, deployed their standard scan formation, and been answered in some number of minutes? How many records like this one were never filed because there was no archive witness positioned at the trailing edge of the formation? I do not know. I cannot know. The Ardent Meridian did not tell me, and I did not ask, and I will not ask. The third conclusion is the one I have spent the most time with, because it is the one that bears most directly on what the Communion does next. The Ardent Meridian was traveling somewhere. It had a heading. It had been resting in the Keth corridor, resting, or waiting, or pausing for some reason my data does not allow me to determine, and then it resumed travel on that heading. The heading, as I noted, was deeper into the outer buffer. Beyond the Keth corridor, in the direction the Ardent Meridian was traveling, our charts show a gradual thinning of charted systems and a long approach to what we designate the boundary zone. The edge of the communion's actively surveyed space, beyond which our archive thins to sparse notation, preliminary long-range reads, civilizations we have logged as existing but not yet fully assessed. Among those sparse notations, at a distance from the Keth corridor that the Ardent Meridian's observed drive characteristics suggest it could cover in somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks, is a system we logged 11 years ago as a mid-tier industrial cluster, multiple inhabited worlds, sublight mining infrastructure, early interstellar capability. A civilization, in short, that we had assessed as interesting but not yet significant. The designation in our archive for that system is Outer Survey Notation 7441. I have, in the hours of this transit, looked up Outer Survey Notation 7441 in the archive more times than I can accurately count. I have read everything we have. I have looked at the preliminary scan data from 11 years ago. I have looked at the long-range spectroscopic reads, the electromagnetic survey, the gravimetric mapping of the system's orbital infrastructure. I cannot tell, from 11-year-old preliminary data, whether the Ardent Meridian is heading to that system specifically, or simply in that general direction, or for some reason entirely unconnected to any inhabited system in that region. But the archive notation for Outer Survey Notation 7441 cross-references, through a chain of survey records that took me 4 hours of this transit to fully trace, to a preliminary contact report from 63 years ago. A survey formation, much smaller than ours, a standard 5-ship probe group, routine sector work that passed through a system adjacent to Outer Survey Notation 7441 and logged a brief encounter with a human vessel on standard electromagnetic frequencies. The encounter log is minimal. The human vessel hailed, identified itself, was assessed as non-threatening sublight capability and was logged and released. The formation moved on. What struck me, reading that 63-year-old notation, was not the encounter itself. It was a single line appended by that formation's own archive witness, a personal note, not required by protocol, filed as a writer to the formal record. The witness wrote, "These vessels are old, older than they should be for the level of civilization we assessed. The hull materials show weathering inconsistent with their stated operational age. I have no explanation for this discrepancy and am flagging it for future reference." No one followed up on the flag. I found it in the archive because I was specifically looking for anomalies in any notation that touched the human civilization space. In 63 years, no one had thought to search. The flag sat there in the record for 6 decades, noticed by no one, because the humans were assessed as pre-significant, and pre-significant civilizations are surveyed once, logged, and revisited on a long-interval schedule that had not, in this case, come due. Hull materials that show weathering inconsistent with their stated operational age. I have been thinking about that line for 11 hours. A hull that shows more age than it should. A hull whose weathering pattern speaks to longer service than the civilization's development timeline would predict. And now, in the Keth corridor, a hull 6,100 meters long whose internal architecture, that distributed nervous system structure, that unrecognized density profile, could not be matched to anything in our archive. The humans have been building things for longer than we knew. They have been building things of a kind we did not expect, with materials we cannot identify, using construction philosophies our archive has no reference for. And somewhere in the process of building those things, across whatever span of time the weathering implies, They learned to build the combat reflex into the hull itself, to burn the answer into the material, to train the vessel the way you train a body, not by installing a system, but by making the response inseparable from the structure. I do not know how you do that. I am not an engineer. I am an archive witness, and what I am witnessing at the end of this long transit is the archive's own limits. The Communion's 11,000 years of accumulated knowledge does not contain the answer to what the Ardent Meridian is, or how it was built, or how many more of them there are, or where they are all going. At the point in my observation around timestamp 5:00:00, the midpoint of those 7 hours in the Keth corridor, I ran a calculation, a simple one. I took the formation's elimination time, 9 minutes and 14 seconds, or 554 seconds, and I divided it by the formation size, 2,700 vessels, and arrived at an average of approximately 0.2 seconds per vessel. One response per 0.2 seconds, sustained for the full duration of the probe lattice sequence. I want to note that this was not the Ardent Meridian operating at any rate that indicated strain or urgency. The response pattern my passive sensors recorded was, throughout, even, calibrated. There were no pauses that I could resolve as the system catching up with itself, no variations in the rate that suggested a system pushed to its limits. If anything, my sensor data suggests the response was operating below its maximum sustainable rate. The formation happened to contain 2,700 vessels. Had it contained 5,000, the math would have simply run longer. I do not say this to overstate what I observed. I say it because accuracy requires it. I am an archive witness, and the archive does not benefit from records that minimize the thing being recorded in order to make the record more comfortable to read. The Ardent Meridian is not the most capable thing we have ever encountered. I do not have enough data to make that assessment. It may be that, within the Communion's full military deployment, there are platforms that would engage it on more favorable terms. It may be that there are countermeasures to its reflex architecture that our doctrine, once updated, could accommodate. It may be that the outcome in the Keth corridor was the result of our doctrine's specific vulnerability to that specific architecture, and that a different approach would yield a different result. All of this is possible. What I am certain of is this: the Ardent Meridian did not lose that encounter. The Ardent Meridian did not experience that encounter as an encounter. It noticed something touching its hull, and its hull answered the touching, and then it resumed its course. That is the last thing I want the convocation to understand. Not the numbers, they will understand the numbers. Not the reflex architecture, they will have analysts who can model the reflex architecture from my sensor data. The last thing I want them to understand, because it is the thing that has occupied my mind throughout this transit, and that no amount of archive precedent has helped me process, is this: the Ardent Meridian resumed its course. When the encounter was over, when the formation's last probe node had gone dark and the corridor had gone quiet, the Ardent Meridian waited at rest for 9 hours and 15 minutes. And then its drive signature changed, and it began to move, and it moved in the same direction it had been moving before. It did not change course. It did not alter its speed significantly. It did not, in any observable way, incorporate the existence of the Keth corridor encounter into its behavior or its heading. It had a direction. It is still going that direction. Whatever is at the end of that direction, the Ardent Meridian is going there, and our formation being in the way did not change that. Our formation being in the way was something the hull resolved automatically, the way you resolve a fly landing on your arm, not a decision, not a delay, not even a thought. A reflex, answered and released and forgotten. That is the category error, and it is not about the ship's capability, though the capability is extraordinary. It is about what the ship's continued movement tells us about the civilization that built it and sent it on this heading. That civilization, in building the Ardent Meridian, built a vessel that does not need to decide whether an interception is survivable before continuing its mission. The decision was already made at the design level, at the substrate level, at the level of what the hull is made of, and how it answers what touches it. They did not give the ship the capability to survive an encounter with 2,700 communion vessels, and then trust it to make good decisions about whether to continue afterward. They gave the ship a hull that answers, and then put the ship on a heading, and trusted the heading to be the only thing the ship needed to think about. They built a vessel that keeps going. They built a vessel that keeps going, and they sent it somewhere, and we were in the way, and it kept going. I have been an archive witness for 112 years. I have filed 4,847 contact records. I have never once, in those 112 years, appended a personal recommendation to a formal record. That is not my function. My function is to observe and record. The decision-making belongs to other castes, other authorities, minds trained for strategy and policy rather than documentation. I am making an exception. My recommendation, and I make it with full awareness that military and strategic assessment is outside my formal function, is simple. Do not scan it again. Whatever it is heading toward, wherever the Ardent Meridian's patient course ends, if we encounter another vessel of its class in another corridor on another heading, and the 63-year-old flag in the archive, and what that flag implies about how long the humans have been building things we did not understand, suggests we may encounter more than one, do not scan it. I do not know what to do instead. I only know what not to do. For 112 years I have known, with the certainty that the communion's methodology provides, what to do in every circumstance. Scan it, understand it, decide. That certainty is gone. I do not have a replacement for it. I have only the absence of it and this record and the long transit to Velasham where I will deliver both. The Ardent Meridian is still out there. It is still going where it was going. And whatever it was going to do when it got there, we did not change it. We did not change it at all. I want to add one final thing to this record, because I believe it is relevant, and because I am aware that by the time the convocation has finished reviewing my sensor data and my conclusions and my recommendation, they will have a question that my record, as composed so far, does not answer. The question they will have is, could we have known? I have spent a significant portion of this transit asking myself that question, in the way that archive witnesses are trained to ask it, systematically, without flinching from the answer, because the archive's value depends on its willingness to look at its own failures with the same dispassion it applies to everything else. The archive is not served by narratives of exoneration. It is served by accuracy. If we could have known, and did not know, the record should say so. Here is what I have found. 43 years ago, as I noted, a survey commander passing through the region adjacent to outer survey notation 7441 logged a notation that the humans appeared to be expanding faster than our preliminary models had predicted, but that the rate of expansion was still well within parameters we would consider manageable. This notation was not followed up. It was filed and retained and not acted upon because the humans were pre-significant, and the rate of expansion of a pre-significant civilization is, in standard doctrine, a matter for long-interval monitoring. 63 years ago, as I noted, an archive witness on a 5-ship probe formation filed a personal rider to a contact report noting that the hull materials of the human vessel they had encountered showed weathering inconsistent with the civilization's assessed development timeline. This observation was not followed up. It was flagged and retained and not acted upon because it was a personal rider filed by a single witness on a brief encounter, and such riders, in standard doctrine, require corroborating evidence before they trigger a formal reassessment. I found 3 other notations in the archive, in my hours of searching, that I want to add to this record. The first, 91 years ago, a patrol vessel in Sector 11, one sector over from the Keth corridor, which is in Sector 12, reported an anomalous gravimetric reading during a routine corridor sweep. The reading was consistent with the passage of a very large mass through the corridor on a bearing that would have taken it from the outer buffer inward, in the direction of communion space, at a speed that the patrol vessel's navigator noted was higher than expected for a vessel of the estimated mass. The navigator flagged it as a possible natural body, a dense asteroid on an unusual trajectory, perhaps, and moved on. No follow-up. 91 years ago. A very large mass, moving inward from the outer buffer, at a speed inconsistent with the natural explanation that was applied to it. I cannot prove that mass was the Ardent Meridian. I cannot prove it was any human vessel. What I can say is that the bearing described in that 91-year-old patrol notation, projected forward 91 years at the drive, characteristics the Ardent Meridian demonstrated in my observation, places a vessel on exactly that heading in exactly the region of the Keth corridor where we found it. And that is, of course, not proof. It is a coincidence of geometry. But I am filing it in this record because the archive's job is to preserve the data, and whether the coincidence means anything is for the convocation to determine. The second notation I found, 107 years ago, before I had begun my service as an archive witness, a survey team conducting deep space spectroscopic work in the buffer zone logged an unusual alloy signature in what they described as a debris field in a surveyed dead zone. The alloy signature did not match any known construction material in the archive. The survey team collected a sample, which was analyzed and filed in the Physical Specimen Archive at Velasham under the classification Unidentified Non-Organic Solid, Origin Unknown, refer to Materials Science Division for further assessment. I have no record of any further assessment having been completed. The sample has been in storage at Velasham for 107 years. I am recommending, as a writer to this record, that the Materials Science Division at Velasham retrieve that sample and compare its density profile to the preliminary scan data I am filing alongside this record. I believe they will find a match. I believe that sample, sitting in storage for 107 years, is a fragment of the same material the Ardent Meridian's hull is made of. I cannot prove this. I am recommending the comparison because, if I am right, it changes the timeline considerably. It means human construction material has been detectable in the buffer zone for more than a century, and we filed it without acting on it. The third notation I found is the hardest to set down, because it bears most directly on the question I asked myself at the beginning of this section. Could we have known? 119 years ago, 7 years before I began my service, which means this record predates my archive access as an active witness, the Communion's Primary Survey Division commissioned a threat assessment study. A large one, the kind of comprehensive analytical document that is prepared every 40 to 60 years to assess whether the distribution of civilizations in the Communion's operational sphere presents any novel strategic concerns. I have read threat assessment studies before. They are thorough documents. They go through every cataloged civilization, every logged contact, every assessed capability, and they produce a ranked analysis of potential concerns. The civilization given the highest attention in the 119-year-old study was the Geithran Compact, because the Geithran had at that time recently completed the construction of their fourth Apex capital ship, bringing their total to 4. And the study's analysts felt this represented a concerning trajectory toward independent military capacity. The study devoted 43 pages to the Geithran question. It devoted, in total, 43 pages to the top 12 concerns in the Communion sphere. The humans received a footnote. Literally, a footnote, appended to a section on pre-significant civilizations with above-average development rates, noting that the species designated in the archive as Outer Survey Notation 7441 related was showing development rates in the 80th percentile of observed pre-significant civilizations, which merited a monitoring flag, but did not rise to the level of formal concern. 80th percentile, 119 years ago. I do not know what percentile they are at now. I know that the Geithrin Compact, whose 4 apex capital ships merited 43 pages of analysis in that study, no longer exists as an independent political entity. I know that the humans, who merited a footnote, have built something like the Ardent Meridian. Could we have known? Yes. I believe we could have known. Not the specific capability, not the hull architecture, not the combat reflex, not the specific numbers, but we could have known that there was something here worth understanding better. The data was in the archive. The flags were in the record. The anomalies were logged. We had a sample of the material sitting in a storage facility at Velasham for 107 years, unanalyzed, because the civilization it potentially came from was assessed as pre-significant, and the archive's attention was on the Geithrin question. I am not filing this to assign culpability. I am filing it because the archive is the archive, and its job, my job, the job I have performed for 112 years, is to preserve the accurate record. The accurate record includes the things we should have done and did not do. That is what honesty costs, and the archive is built on honesty, or it is built on nothing. So yes, we could have known. We had the data to know. We did not assemble it into knowledge because our attention was elsewhere, and because the humans were pre-significant, and because the methodology that has served us for 11 millennia is very good at many things but is, it turns out, not well designed for noticing threats that are developing slowly in regions we have assessed as unimportant. The Ardent Meridian was not a surprise that appeared without warning. It was a surprise that announced itself in fragments, across 119 years, in records that are all sitting in the archive right now, available to anyone who looks. No one looked. I am looking now. It is too late for it to matter in the way it would have mattered had someone looked 60 years ago, or 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago. But I am looking, and I am filing what I find because that is what archive witnesses do, and because the convocation at Velasham deserves to see the full shape of what we were not paying attention to. The full shape is this: a civilization that 119 years ago was a footnote in a threat assessment, has built a vessel 6,100 meters long whose hull responds to a scan, the way muscle memory responds to a practiced motion, without thought, below decision, inscribed into the structure at a level our own archive has no precedent for. And that vessel is heading somewhere, and we do not know how many more there are. And the sample that might tell us something about the material has been sitting in storage at Velasham for 107 years. I have filed this record. I am Sarath 7, archive witness, sole survivor of the Keth Corridor Survey formation. The Ardent Meridian is still going where it was going. We did not change it at all.